Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm going to talk now about a book that has really had profound implications for me. I don't know if that is that the best way to say it. A book that has had an amazing impact on me, that has impressed me thoroughly. Milton's Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained. They're separate works, but they're often published together. They weren't written simultaneously. Paradise Lost was written, and then later Paradise Regained. They're written with in the same form, same style. Paradise Lost is usually the preferred one. It's longer than Regained. Most readers prefer it because it's sort of more exciting. The Paradise Regained is more of a sort of a commentary or an abridgment or discussion of the Gospels and the life of Jesus, basically. So it's, basically in a way rehashing the Gospels. Whereas Paradise Lost it's an original story. Well, of course, based on Christian tradition and biblical figures creatively recast. I think, in both cases, Milton's original or peculiar theology comes across in both. It's really amazing. And but it's not. It's not something that every element which I share. I certainly don't have the same theological opinions of Milton in every case, which is not surprising. He was a Puritan Protestant. But I think, for someone like me with a Catholic background, there's a lot that I can appreciate and a lot that's intriguing, interesting, curious, all that stuff. That's its content. But its form is exceptionally beautiful. The first thing you're confronted with, of course, is an introduction that Milton gives to the poem, and it's a very famous introduction, and it's polemical and apologetic, I suppose. He says that the measure is English heroic verse without rhyme, as that of Homer in Greek and of Virgil in Latin, rhyme being no necessary adjunct or true ornament of poem or good verse. And he calls it the invention of a barbarous age. Now that's interesting, of course, because Milton uses rhymes in his other works, not in his great long works like Samson Agonistes or Paradise Lost or Paradise Regained, but in his shorter poems he uses rhyming, and he's very good at it, obviously. But he makes a point here that rhyming is an unserious device, and Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained is serious. It's a serious subject. And famously he says that the book is about, or the intention of the poem is to justify the ways of God to men, so that I may assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men. Now, justify means to explain. When you think of the Pauline sense of justification, to explain, it's to lay the rationality for. It's masterful. People in the Catholic tradition don't know Milton and don't know Paradise Lost and Regained as much as they know Dante. But the problem is, Dante didn't write in English, and when we concentrate too much on Dante because of its theological and historical value, I don't think we're getting as good a grounding in poetry as we might. Even when we deal with the beautiful and wonderful, valuable translations of Dante by people like Longfellow, it's not the original. Not to say that it's not without value. We only have to think of Keats' poem on first looking in the Chapman's Homer, that this translation by Chapman was so profound and was so moving and impactful to Keats that he wrote one of his most famous poems about a translation. Works in translation impact us. Look no further than the Bible. Who of us have read the Old Testament in Hebrew or Greek and the New Testament in Greek? Not many of us, and it's enormously impactful. I'm making a case here for Milton, and Milton was extremely important to English poetry. I think that Keats probably, he seems to refer to Milton almost as often as he refers to Shakespeare, and other people like Coleridge and so on keep, referring back to Milton. I think that, there's a danger for having to forget how great a poet, how massive a figure Milton is in the English tradition, because we only really concentrate on Shakespeare in school, at least in earlier grades in high school and so on. There's things about Milton's theology that are off-putting to modern people. His Calvinistic theology is grim. It's not flowery. It's not joyful, wonderful, uplifting, easy stuff. It's more of a rigoristic, Jansenistic, Calvinistic background. And that's not very attractive in our secularized culture. But I think that there's a great deal of value in the content of Milton in his meditation on original sin, the nature of the demons, and so on. You don't have to agree with it, but it's definitely worth thinking about. His discussion of human nature, his presentation of the relationship between Adam and Eve is extremely touching, and it's beautiful. But most of all, of course, the poetry is powerful and beautiful. His diction, his touch with the word is, almost second to none, perhaps second to Shakespeare. And so just like, for instance, Alexander Pope's essays on human nature, this is a very long essay on human nature. And even though, the most memorable character, of course, in Paradise Lost is Satan, his discussion, Milton's presentation of Adam and Eve is really quite amazing. I mean, there's lots of historical value, there's lots of theological value, and so on. So it's almost like an inexhaustible treasure in a way. You can think that for a short time, or for a small audience, Milton perhaps was as important to people like Keats as Homer was to people like Alexander the Great or Plato or whomever. So the problem is, of course, is that this is a secularized culture now. And so we don't look to our poets, or I should say to our very early poets, early English poets like Milton, as as the Greeks looked to Homer. We don't look to them for guidance, for spiritual or intellectual guidance. That doesn't mean that Milton wasn't as great as Homer or whatever. Milton deserves to be read and reread, as do all the great works of our civilization. And there's so much profundity and beauty in Milton's verses that they still should serve as a lesson for poets and writers now as they ever did. And I happen to agree with Milton about rhyming, about his introduction to Paradise Lost, in that I don't know if I have the exact same rationale as he did, that rhyming shouldn't be used for serious works. I agree with that. But I also think that rhyming in English is especially problematic in that because English is a non-inflected language, or at least a very lightly inflected language, rhyming is, because of that, it's impoverished. We have such a smaller number of the words we have at our hands for rhyming are just so much fewer than Latin does, for instance, or I would imagine than French and Italian do. It's just the nature of our language. So trees and these and stars and afar, we're almost, it's a sad state of affairs. So I think that for great poetry in the English language, we have to fall back on meter much more so than on rhyming and other devices like alliteration. And that's, anyway, take it or leave it. Frankly, rhyme does sometimes become quite distracting. It's such a blatant literary device that it can be distracting, and it makes us rush to the end of a line to that final sound, and to compare it with the final sounds of other lines, that we miss the effect, the subtler effect of the feet. So I think for that reason that Milton's correct, that rhyme does distract from serious themes. It does undermine serious themes. But anyway, this short little discussion of Milton, of Paradise Lost and Regained, seems hardly to do the great works justice. Let's just say, maybe conclude with an overview of the storyline. So the story begins with Satan and the demons being kicked out of heaven after battle with Michael and the other angels, and they're brooding and they try and figure out what they're going to do next. And there's a presentation of them in hell and its vast sort of unpleasant atmosphere. And then the demons sort of have a conference and discuss what they're going to do next. And so Satan decides, as the most powerful and as their leader, that he's going to go scout about and see what he can do, because he heard the prophecy of a new creation, the creation of man, of course, and he's going to see what's going on there. So ultimately, he's able to sneak through the barrier between hell and the rest of the world, or the rest of the universe, whatever you want to call it. He is able to lay eyes on Adam and Eve, and he watches them, and ultimately, we know the way the story progresses there. And of course, Milton's retelling of it is is quite remarkable, quite wonderful, quite worth the read. And in the end, when the sentence is passed, the beautiful discussion and the implications, the relationship between Adam and Eve is really quite amazing. There's a book, one of the books is basically a discussion that Raphael, the angel Raphael, has with Adam, where he discusses all the important theology of humanity, of God's purpose in creating man, his intention for man, and the dangers of human life and of sin and all that. And then, of course, it ends with the expulsion, and ends with basically the expulsion and the Son interceding on behalf of Adam and Eve, and then the prophecy of what's to come with the incarnation and the redemption. And so it's 12 books. Paradise Lost is 12 books, whereas Paradise Regained is only 3. It's 4 books. It's a mere fraction in the length of Paradise Lost, but it's beautiful and valuable and good. And to me, it's a great encouragement for learning how to write meter well, and rather than focus on rhyme, and how discouraging poetry can be when you're wrapped up in finding rhyming words. So I find it a great encouragement. Some of the theological issues are extremely interesting, and really it's been said, and I think that Paradise Lost and Regained pretty solidly proves the fact that Milton is a binitarian and not a trinitarian. He may even be an Arian. Now, what do those things mean? Milton doesn't seem to believe the traditional Christian doctrine of the Trinity, that God is a Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, 3 equal, co-eternal, co-powerful, co-everything person. He seems to, well, if he was an Arian, he would believe only that the Father is God. I think he's a binitarian, though. I think he thinks that the Son is God as well, but I don't think he thinks that the Holy Spirit is God, or at least in the same sense that the Father and the Son are. But anyway, it's interesting. The presentation of the roles of the Father and the Son are extremely interesting. The Holy Spirit basically doesn't exist, or doesn't play any role in the story. The angels seem to occupy place of the Holy Spirit in a certain sense, in the narrative anyway. Now, of course, if you're well versed in theology, you know that there's many additional potential problems for Milton's orthodoxy as a theologian. And is he an adoptionist? Like, was there a time before the Son was God, and did he become God by the Father's choice? There's lots of little mysteries to look into as you're reading the poem along those lines, if you're super interested in nitpicky theology. And it's also a wonderful story, or I should say, it's also a wonderful study of anthropology, Christian anthropology. What is man? Why was he made? What is he like? What is his destination? What is his essential characteristic? What are the essential virtues and vices of human nature? His essential experiences? And I think another thing that's especially interesting and especially Protestant, rather than Catholic, is his contemplation of the relationship of the sexes, of man and woman together. They say, well, why is that so Protestant? Well, Protestants were much more interested in the theology of womanhood than Catholics were, for the central reason that the Catholic power brokers were unmarried. The priests and bishops were unmarried, and the most powerful female figures in Catholicism were nuns. So the theology of marriage was not nearly as developed as at the time as was Protestant theology, because since Luther condemned celibacy, he put the theology of marriage into a much more central position. That's clear to see in Milton, in Paradise Lost and Regained. Paradise Lost, the theology of marriage, of what we call in Catholicism today, the theology of the body. Milton seems to be ahead of his Catholic contemporaries in that regard. So it's kind of interesting. It's interesting in that regard. Anyway, the poem is powerful, wonderful, beautiful, extremely important and influential on subsequent writers. When you think of people like Keats or Blake or whomever, the poems have, I think today we need to study them some more. I think we need to put them back in their place of importance. So anyway, I hope I've done a bit of justice to Paradise Lost and Regained. Obviously, there's so much more that can be said for these poems, and I hope you'll read them.